Hello, everybody. You're reading with Jimmy. This is Jimmy, and we're reading Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. This is part one of a two-part reading. Let's begin. The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. Zone est, I don't know how to read French, but that's a French quote. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within the view of the melancholy House of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half-pleasurable, because poetic, sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house, and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul, which I could compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. What was it? I paused to think. What was it that so unnerved me in the contemplation of the House of Usher? It was a mystery, all insoluble. Nor could I grapple with the shadowy fancies that crowded upon me as I pondered. I was forced to fall back upon the unsatisfactory conclusion that while beyond doubt there are combinations of very simple natural objects which have the power of thus affecting us, still the analysis of all this power lies among considerations beyond our depth. It was possible, I reflected, that a mere different arrangement of the particulars of the scene, of the details of the picture, would be sufficient to modify or perhaps to annihilate its capacity for sorrowful impression. And acting on this idea, I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of the black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling, and I gazed down, but with a shudder even more thrilling than before, because upon the remodeled and inverted images of the gray sedge and the ghastly tree stems and the vacant eye-like windows, nevertheless, in this mansion of gloom, I now proposed to myself a sojourn of some weeks. Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in boyhood. But many years had elapsed since our last meeting. A letter, however, had lately reached me in a distant part of the country, a letter from him, which, in its wild, impromptu nature, had admitted of no other than a personal reply. The MS gave evidence of a nervous agitation. The writer spoke of acute bodily illness, of a mental disorder which oppressed him, and of an earnest desire to see me. So at his best, and indeed his only personal friend, with a view of attempting by the cheerfulness of my society some alleviation of his malady. It was the manner in which all of this and much more was said. It was the apparent heart that went with his request, which allowed me no room for hesitation, and I accordingly obeyed forthwith, and still considered a very singular summons. Although as boys we had been very intimate associates, I really knew very little of my friend. His reserve had always been excessive and habitual. I was aware, however, that his very ancient family had been noted, time out of mind, for a peculiar sensibility of temperament, displaying itself through long ages in many works of exalted art, and manifested of late in repeated deeds of munificent yet unobtrusive charity, as well as in the passionate devotion to the intricacies, perhaps even more than to the orthodox and easily recognizable beauty of musical science. I had learned, too, the very remarkable fact that Usher race, all-time honored as it was, had put forth at no period any enduring branch. In other words, that the entire family lay in the direct lines of descent and had always, with very trifling and very temporary variations, so lain. It was this deficiency I considered while running over in thought the perfect keeping of the character of the premises with the accredited character of the people, and while speculating upon the possible influence which the one, in the long lapse of centuries, might have exercised on the other. It was this deficiency, perhaps, of collateral issue, and the consequent undeviating transmission from sire to son of the patrimony with the name, which had at length so identified the two as to merge the original title of the estate in the quaint and unequivocal appellation of the House of Usher, an appellation which seemed to include in the minds of the peasantry who used it both the family and the mansion. There can be no doubt, I've said, that the sole effect of my somewhat childish experiment, that of looking down into the tarn, had been to deepen the first singular impression. There could be no doubt that the consciousness of the rapid increase of my superstition, for why should I not so term it, served mainly to accelerate the increase itself. Such I have long known is the paradoxical law of all sentiments having terror as a basis. And it might have been for this reason only that when I again uplifted my eyes to the house itself, from its image in the pool, there grew in my mind a strange fancy, a fancy so ridiculous indeed, that I mention it just to show that with vivid force, with sensations which oppressed me. I had so worked up my imagination as to really believe that about the whole mansion and domain there hung an atmosphere peculiar to themselves and their immediate vicinity, an atmosphere which had no affinity with the air of heaven, but which had reeked up from the decayed trees and the gray wall and the silent tarn, a pestilent, mystic vapor, dull, sluggish, faintly discernible, and leaden-hued. Shaking off my spirit what must have been a dream, I scanned more narrowly the real aspect of the building. Its principal features seemed to be that of excessive antiquity. The discoloration of ages had been great. Minute fungi overspread the whole exterior, hanging in a fine, tangled webwork from the eaves. Yet all this was apart from any extraordinary dilapidation. No portion of the masonry had fallen, and there appeared to be a wild inconsistency between its still perfect adaptation of parts and the crumbling condition of the individual stones. In this there was much that reminded me of the species totality of old woodwork which had rotten for long years in some neglected vault, with no disturbance from the breath of external air. But beyond this indication of extensive decay, the fabric gave little token of instability. Perhaps the eye of the scrutinizing observer might have discovered a barely perceptible fissure, which, extending from the roof of the building in front, made its way down the wall in a zigzag direction until it became lost in the sullen waters of the tarn. Noticing these things, I rode over a short causeway to the house. A servant in waiting took my horse, and I entered the Gothic archway of the hall. A valet of stealthy step thence conducted me in silence through many dark and intricate passages in my progress to the studio of his master. Much that I encountered on the way contributed, I don't know how, to heighten the vague sentiments of which I've already spoken. While the objects around me, the carvings of the ceilings, the somber tapestries of the walls, the ebon blackness of the floors, and the phantasmagoric armorial trophies which rattled as I strode, were but matters to which, or such to which, that I had been accustomed from my infancy, while I hesitated not to acknowledge how familiar all this was, I still wondered to find out how unfamiliar were the fancies which ordinary images were stirring up. On the one of the staircases, I met the physician of the family. His countenance, I thought, wore a mingled expression of low cunning and perplexity. He accosted me with a trepidation and passed on. The valet now threw open the door and ushered me into the presence of his master. The room in which I found myself was very large and lofty. The windows were long, narrow, and pointed, and so vast a distance from the black oaken floor as to be altogether inaccessible from within. Feeble gleams of crimson light made their way through the trestle panes and served to render sufficiently distinct the more prominent objects around. The eye, however, struggled in vain to reach the remoter angles of the chamber, or the recesses of the vaulted and fretted ceiling. Dark draperies hung upon the walls. The general furniture was profuse, comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but they failed to give any vitality to the scene. I felt that I breathed an atmosphere of sorrow, an air of stern, deep, and irredeemable gloom hung over and pervaded all. Upon my entrance, Usher arose from the sofa on which he had been lying full length, and he greeted me with a vivacious warmth which had much in it, I first thought, of an overdone cordiality, of the constrained effort of the ennuyé man of the world. A glance, however, at his countenance convinced me of his perfect sincerity. And so we sat down, and for some moments, while he spoke not, I gazed upon him with a feeling half of pity, half of awe. Surely man had never before so terribly altered in so brief a period as had Roderick Usher. It was with difficulty that I could even bring myself to admit the identity of the wan being before me with the companion of my early boyhood. Yet the character of his face had been at all times remarkable, a cadaverousness of complexion, an eye large, liquid, and luminous beyond comparison, lips somewhat thin and very pallid, but of a surprisingly beautiful curve, a nose of a delicate Hebrew model, but with a breadth of nostril unusual in similar formations, a fine molded chin, speaking in its want of prominence, of a want of moral energy, hair of a more than web-like softness and tenuity. These features, with an inordinate expansion above the regions of the temple, made up altogether a countenance not easily to be forgotten. And now, in the mere exaggeration of the prevailing character of the features and of the expression that they were wont to convey, lay so much of a change that I doubted to whom I spoke. The now ghastly pallor of the skin and the now miraculous luster of the eyes, above all things, startled and even awed me. The silken hair, too, had been suffered to grow all unheeded, and as it was a wild gossamer texture, it kind of floated and fell about the face. I could not, even with effort, connect its arabesque expression with any idea of simple humanity. In the manner of my friend, I was at once struck with an incoherence, an inconsistency, and I soon found this to arise from a series of feeble and futile struggles to overcome an habitual trepidancy, an excessive nervous agitation. for something of this nature I had indeed been prepared no less by his letter than by reminiscences of certain boyish traits, and by conclusions deduced from his peculiar physical conformation and temperament. His actions were alternatively vivacious and sullen. His voice varied rapidly from a tremulous indecision, when the animal spirits seemed utterly in abeyance, to that species of energetic concession, that abrupt, weighty, unhurried, and hollow-sounding enunciation, that leaden self-balance and perfectly modulated guttural utterance, which may be observed in the lost drunkard or in the irreclaimable eater of opium during periods of most intense excitement. It was thus that he spoke of the object of my visit, of his earnest desire to see me, and of the solace that he expected me to afford him. He entered at some length into what he conceived to be the nature of his malady. It was, he said, a constitutional and a family evil, and one for which he despaired to find a remedy, a mere nervous affection. He immediately added, which would undoubtedly soon pass off, it displayed itself in a host of unnatural sensations. Some of these, as he detailed them, interested and bewildered me, although perhaps the terms of the general manner of their narration had their weight. He suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses. The most insipid food was alone endurable. He could wear only garments of a certain texture. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even the faint light. And there were by peculiar sounds, and there from stringed instruments, which he could not inspire him with horror. To an anomalous species of terror, I found him a burdened slave. I shall perish, said he. I must perish in this deplorable folly. Thus, and not otherwise shall I be lost. I dread the events of the future, not in themselves, but in their results. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident, which may operate upon this intolerable agitation of soul. I have indeed no abhorrence of danger, except in its absolute effect, in terror. In this unnerved, in this pitiable condition, I feel that the period will sooner or later arrive when I must abandon life and reason altogether, in some struggle with that grim phantasm, fear. I learned, moreover, at intervals and through broken and equivocal hints, another singular feature of his mental condition. He was enchained by certain superstitious impressions in regard to the dwelling which he tenanted, and which, for many years, he had never ventured forth. In regard to an influence upon superstitious forces, was conveyed in terms to the shadowy here, to be restated, an influence of some peculiarities in the mere form and substance of his family mansion, had, by dint of long sufferance, he said, obtained over his spirit. An effect which the physique of the grey walls and turrets, the dim tarn into which they all looked down, they had at length all of it brought upon the morale of his existence. He admitted, however, although with hesitation, that much of the peculiar gloom which afflicted him could be traced to a more natural and far more palpable origin, to the severe and long-continued illness, indeed, to the evidently approaching disillusion of a tenderly beloved sister, his sole companion for long years, his last and only relative on earth. Her decease, he said, with a bitterness which I can never forget, would leave him, the hopeless and the frail, the last of the ancient race of Ushers. While he spoke, the Lady Madeline, for so she was called, passed through a remote portion of the apartment, and without having noticed my presence, disappeared. I regarded her with an utter astonishment, not unmingled with dread, and yet I found it impossible to account for such feelings. A sensation of stupor oppressed me as my eyes followed her retreating steps, and when a door at length closed upon her, my glance sought instinctively and eagerly the countenance of the brother, but he had buried his face in his hands, and I could only perceive that a far more than ordinary wanness had oppressed and emancipated fingers through which trickled many passionate tears. The disease of the Lady Madeline had long baffled the skill of her physicians. A settled apathy, a gradual wasting away of the person, and frequent although transient affections of partially cataleptical character were the usual diagnosis. Hitherto, she had steadily borne up against the pressure of her malady and had not betaken herself finally to bed. But on the closing in of the evening of my arrival at that house, she succumbed, as her brother told me at night, with inexpressible agitation, to the prostrating power of the destroyer. And I learned that the glimpse I had obtained of her person would thus probably be the last I should obtain, that the lady, at least while living, would be seen by me no more. For several days ensuing, her name was unmentioned by either Usher or myself, and during this period I busied in earnest endeavors to alleviate the melancholy of my friend. We painted and read together, or I listened, as if in a dream, to the wild improvisations of his speaking guitar. And thus, as a closer and still closer intimacy admitted me more unreservedly into the recesses of his spirit, the more bitterly I perceived the futility of all the attempt at cheering a mind from which darkness, as if an inherent positive quality, poured forth upon all objects of the moral and physical universe in one unceasing radiation of gloom. I shall ever bear about me a memory of the many solemn hours that I spent alone with the master of the House of Usher. And yet, I should fail in any attempt to convey an idea of the exact character of the studies, or of the occupations in which he involved me or led me the way. An excited and highly distempered ideality threw a sulphurous luster over all. His long impoverished dirges will ring forever in my ears. Among other things, I hold painfully in mind a certain singular perversion and amplification of the wild air of the last waltz of Van Weber. And from the paintings over which his elaborate fancy brooded, and which grew, touch by touch, into vagueness, at which I shuddered the more thrillingly, because I shuddered not knowing why. From these paintings, vivid as their images now are before me, I would in vain endeavor to adduce more than a small portion which should lie within the compass of merely written words. By the utter simplicity, by the nakedness of his designs, he arrested and overawed attention. If ever a mortal painted an ideal, that mortal was Roderick Usher. For me, at least, in the circumstances then surrounding me, there arose out of a pure abstraction which the hypochondriac contrived to throw upon his canvas an intensity of intolerable awe, no shadow of which I ever yet, in the contemplation of the certainty glowing yet, too concrete reveries of Fuseli. One of the phantasmagoric conceptions of my friend, partaking not so rigidly of the spirit of abstraction, may be shadowed forth, although feebly, in words. A small picture presented the interior of an immensely long, rectangular vault or tunnel of low walls, smooth, white, without interruption or device. Certain accessory points of the design served well to convey the idea that this excavation lay at an exceeding depth below the surface of the earth. There was no outlet, was observed, in any portion of its vast extent, and no torch or other artificial source of light was discernible, and yet a flood of intense rays rolled throughout and bathed the whole in a ghastly and inappropriate splendor. I had just spoken of that morbid condition of the auditory nerve which rendered all music intolerable to the sufferer, with the exception of certain effects of stringed instruments. It was perhaps the narrow limits to which he thus confined himself upon the guitar, which gave birth in great moments to the fantastic character of his performances. But the fervid facility of his impromptu could not be so accounted for. They must have been, and were, in the notes as well as in the worlds of wild fantasies, for he not unfrequently accompanied himself with the rhymed verbal improvisations. The result of that intense mental collectedness and concentration to which I have previously alluded as observational only in particular moments of the highest artificial excitement. The words of one of the rhapsodies I've easily remembered, and I was perhaps the more forcibly impressed with it as he gave it, because in the under or mystic current of the meaning I fancied that I perceived, and for the first time, a full consciousness on the part of Usher of the tottering of his lofty reason upon the throne. The verses which here entitled The Haunted Palace ran very nearly, if not accurately, thus. In the greenness of our valleys, by good angels tenanted, once a fair and stately palace, radiant palace, reared its head. In the monarch thought's dominion, it stood there. Never seraph spread a pinion over fabric half so fair. Banners yellow, glorious, golden, on its roof did float and flow. All this, was in the olden time long ago. And every gentle air that dallied in that sweet day, along the ramparts, plumed and pallied, a winged odor went away. Wanderers in that happy valley, through two luminous windows saw spirits moving musically to a lute's well-tuned law. Round about a throne were sitting Pomagene. In the state his glory well befitting, the ruler of the realm was seen. And with all the pearl and ruby glowing was the fair palace door, through which came flowing, and sparkling evermore, a troop of echoes, whose sweet duty was but to sing, in voices of surpassing beauty, the wit and wisdom of their king. But evil things in robes of sorrow assailed the monarch's high estate. Ah, let us mourn, for never morrow shall dawn upon him desolate. And round about his home, the glory that blushed in bloom is but a dim remembered story of the old time entombed. And travelers now within that valley, through the red litten windows see vast forms that move fantastically to a discordant melody, while like a rapid, ghastly river, through the pale door, a hideous throng rush out forever and laugh, but smile no more. I well remember the suggestions arising from this ballad led us into a train of thought wherein there became a manifest an opinion of Usher's, which I mentioned not so much as an account of its novelty, for other men have thought thus, as on account of the propensity with which he maintained it. This opinion in its general form was that of the sentience of all vegetable things, but in his disordered fancy, the idea had assumed a more daring character and trespassed under certain conditions upon the kingdom of inorganization. I lack the words to express the full extent or to the earnest abandon of his persuasion. The belief, however, was connected, as I've previously hinted, with the gray stones of the home of his forefathers. The conditions of the sentience had been here, he imagined, fulfilled in the method of collection of these stones and in the order of their arrangement, as well as in that of the many fungi which overspread them and of the decayed trees which stood around, above all in the long, undisturbed endurance of this arrangement, and in its reduplication in the still waters of the Tarn. Its evidence, the evidence of the sentience, was to be seen, he said, and here I started as he spoke, in the gradual yet certain condensation of the atmosphere of their own about the waters and the walls. The result was discoverable, he added, in that silent yet impromptu and terrible influence with which centuries had molded the densities of his family, and which made him, what I now saw him, what he was. Such opinions need no comment, and I will make none. Our books, the books which for years had formed no small portion of the mental existence of the invalid, were, as might be supposed, in strict keeping with the character of phantasm. We pored over such works as the Verret de Chartreuse of Grisset, the Bielgor of Machiavelli, the Heaven and Hell of Swedenborg, the Subterranean Voyage of Nicholas Klim of Hollenberg, the Chronopsony of Robert Flood, of Jean d'Imagine, and of Della Chamber, the Journey into the Blue Distance of the Tech, and of the City of the Sun of Campanella. One favorite volume was a small avacto edition of the Directorium Inquisitorium by the Dominican Emeric de Journay, and there were passages in the Pampinas Mela about the old African satires and Egyptians over which Usher would sit dreaming for hours. His chief delight was found in the pursuit of an extremely rare and curious book in quarto Gothic, the Manual of the Forgotten Church, the Vigili Moratorium Secundum Carosum Ecclesiasti Maginete. I could not help thinking of the wild ritual of this work and of its probable influence upon the hypochondriac, when, one evening, having informed me abruptly that the Lady Madeline was no more, he stated his intention of preserving her corpse for a fortnight, previously to her final interment, in one of the numerous vaults within the main walls of the building. The worldly reason, however, assigned for this, we're going to stop there for part one. Thank you for visiting. You're reading with Jimmy. This is part one of the full reading of Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. Part two is coming up. Then review our video analysis of this very complex story. And I apologize for mispronunciations of foreign words. That's because Jimmy's just concerned about English. English gives him enough trouble. Remember, if you have any questions, email me, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Thanks so much for listening. See you for part two.